And we're happy to have finishing for us Carey Morewedge, who got his PhD at Harvard before becoming a professor at Carnegie Mellon and is now the Everett Lord Distinguished Faculty Scholar and Professor of Marketing at Boston University, where he likes to study biases. He likes to study what drives people to perceive value, but today he's going to talk about his newer research on algorithms and what makes people accept algorithms. It's an interesting and exploding area for lots of obvious reasons. So without further ado, please, Carey.
Thanks, Nathan. So, the study of algorithm adoption is not new. So, for 30 years, we've known that in many kinds of domains, algorithms like simple linear models perform as well as experts in a variety of different kinds of tasks. And this work has also told us that experts are reluctant to rely on these kinds of algorithms for things that are highly consequential. So we can think about, there are many kinds of domains in which experts don't adopt algorithms, such as in making high stakes personnel decisions, like whom to hire. We can think about experts being reluctant to use algorithms to recommend who to let out and who to release on bail and whom to lock up. And we can think about experts are reluctant to rely on algorithms for things like graduate admissions or hiring kinds of contexts where the algorithms are outperforming the experts for a variety of different kinds of reasons. And the general perception has been that for a long time that people are reticent to rely on algorithms for a variety of different kinds of domains. But as research in this area has grown, we've seen that varies a lot more depending on the type of task that people are using. So there are some tasks for which people are still reluctant to rely on algorithms, but there are many kinds of tasks now where we can actually have a preference to rely on algorithms than on humans. So I'll give you two personal examples. So for example, if you're thinking about how to get to the train station or the airport from this conference, I would suggest that there are many experts in the room who could tell you, but you're going to use an algorithm. And you prefer to use an algorithm than talk to an expert on how to get to get your directions, right? Conversely, if you're thinking about with whom would you rather have an intimate conversation, an algorithm might be more interested in what you have to say, but you would probably be more interested in talking to a human, right? And so we can think about these kinds of domains. There's going to be interesting kinds of differences between domains that will determine whether or not people are interested in relying on algorithms or humans. And this is a big problem, not only for in personal life, but you can think about in firms. Yutting showed us a talk where we see that we have developed these algorithms in many kinds of cases. It's hard for us to get even our employees to use them to their financial benefit. So there's certainly many kinds of barriers to algorithm adoption. And I think that I'm not going to talk about pure rational kinds of economic kinds of choices. So in many cases, algorithms are costly, they have fewer benefits, they're more risky, they have worse performance. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to control for these kinds of factors and look more at psychological factors that are influencing people's willingness to rely on algorithms. I'm going to look at that in the context of medical artificial intelligence, which I'll define as being any machine that uses any kind of algorithm or statistical model to perform perceptual, cognitive, and conversational functions typical of the human mind, such as visual and speech recognition, reasoning, and problem solving. And I think medical AI is a really interesting kind of context because most of these decisions are pretty objective. They're high stakes, right? So people should really care about them. And they're also prevalent. So medical AI is predicted to introduced to be about 90% of all hospitals and take up as much of 80% of what doctors currently do. And you can think about AI, medical AI is also really interesting from a utilization perspective because in many cases people are not deciding whether or not to see a human healthcare provider or an AI. In many cases around the world, there's just simply not enough human providers, and so people are simply deciding whether or not to go get any treatment or to rely on an AI, and this may become a bigger and bigger issue as time goes on. So we've done some really simple kinds of studies looking at are people reluctant to use medical AI given the stakes and its objectivity. I'll show you one kind of incentive compatible study. So we had undergraduates come into a laboratory. Most undergraduate students report being stressed, and so we offered to give them an analysis of their stress levels with behavioral recommendations on how to manage them. And so the analysis would consist of a paper and pen survey and then a salivary cortisol sample. And then we simply asked them whether or not they'd be willing to sign up right then for the analysis. And so What we manipulated between conditions was whether or not the analysis would be analyzed by a human or an algorithm provider, but they were given the same inputs. So the survey and the salivary cortisol sample, we told them that they had the same diagnostic accuracy, they would receive the same test results, and in both cases it was free. So again, people only know about one condition, not the other. So you either have a human doing the analysis or an algorithm doing the analysis. And then we simply measured who was willing to sign up right away. So we're about 40% of our sample was willing to sign up right away for this test. If the provider was human, we found only 27% were willing to sign up for the test if it was an algorithm. So if you think this is a sort of an aberration, we've tested this and find similar kinds of results in the case of prevention, diagnosis, and treatment. So whether we're looking at things like diagnosis of skin melanoma, whether or not you want to go to the ER based on a chatbot triage service, or a cardiac surgery that's performed with medical AI. So a couple takeaways in this. What we see in our results is that this reluctance to utilize algorithms seems more like a price than a rule. So in other words, you can think about some kinds of decisions we make are non-compensatory. So if you're a vegetarian, I could offer you steak for free and you still wouldn't eat it, right? So the price really has no effect on whether or not you're willing to eat steak. We don't see that there's a sample of people who are wholly reluctant to rely on an algorithm in any kind of case, but an algorithm has some kind of disutility that a human does not. And so relying on an algorithm is paying a price in these kinds of circumstances. The next thing we see is it's not just the fact that there's an algorithm involved in a decision process. In medical AI, there's many different kinds of differences from doctors. They have different training, they may use different inputs, they may use different decision processes, they may communicate with patients in different kinds of ways. But we find that what people really object to is an algorithm making an unsupervised decision. So if we look at a skin cancer kind of scenario and we say that a nurse is going to take photographs of your skin, she'll send that to a lab, it'll be either analyzed by an algorithm which makes a diagnosis and your PCP will report that back to you, or it's analyzed by a human. People are much less likely to utilize the service, significantly less likely to use the service if the AI decides than if the human decides. But if the AI makes a recommendation to your GP, and then your GP makes the final call, people are no less likely to use the algorithm than the human. Right? So people really object to algorithms making unsupervised decisions, not necessarily making recommendations or providing input. We've looked at two kinds of psychological barriers in this space. One is this idea of individual exceptionalism, where we call it uniqueness neglect. And that's the idea that algorithms are built really for large classes of people. They're looking at sort of the average kind of person, but I'm an exception. So like my health history is unique, my characteristics of my disease are unique. You have the cold and I have a cold, right? And so in these kinds of cases, we should see that this kind of reluctance should be moderated by who receives treatment. And so we have a bunch of different studies exploring this kind of phenomena, but I think it's best illustrated by this one, where we have people think about whether or not to follow a recommendation to have coronary bypass surgery that's made either by a human or an algorithm, with similar kinds of inputs, similar kinds of accuracy. And so we have three different conditions. One in which the patient is you, one in which the patient is an individuated other, someone that you feel like you have some idea of who they are and what they're like, and the other one is that the patient is an average other. And what we see in this kind of work is we see that people would be more likely to follow the recommendations of the human healthcare provider than the algorithm if the patient is themselves or someone whom they know well, like a friend or a family member. But when it's an average patient, people don't see the difference. And people think that average patients should be willing to follow this kind of recommendation. Similarly, whether it's a human or an algorithm. And I think this is interesting for like two reasons. One is it's telling us that we think that we're special, and there's something about algorithms that doesn't capture that kind of uniqueness about our personality or who we are. And the second thing is that the kinds of reluctance that people exhibit may depend, like our awareness of it may depend on who's making the decision or at what level of health systems people are thinking. So, for example, patients may be reticent to rely on algorithms, but doctors may not realize that because doctors are thinking of the average patient, they're not thinking about an individual patient. Similarly, healthcare administrators may not be sensitive to this because they're thinking about the class of patients, not individuals, as we would if we're thinking about a medical decision for ourselves or our family member. The next kind of bias we've been looking at, or psychological bias in this case, is one called the illusion of explanatory depth. And this is, in many kinds of cases, we feel like we don't have an idea of how algorithms make decisions, and that's often true, right? So even the designers of algorithms often have no idea why a particular algorithm gave a certain class of variables different parameter weights. It can depend a lot on the particular fold you use to train the data, and because a lot of different kinds of variables are correlated, and so it's hard to make sense of exactly why the algorithm is weighting these parameters and not others, right? But and so people have shown that kind of perspective of algorithms as being a black box, not really understanding their decision process, can inhibit their adoption. But what's really interesting is that human decisions are also a black box in many different kinds of ways. There's a lot of work going back to the 1970s that suggests that we have access to the output of our decision process, what we like, but we lack more access to the process by which we made that decision, why we chose that thing. So Richard Nisbet and colleagues, for example, ran a study with shoppers, and they showed women 4 different pairs of hose. They're identical, but they were most people preferred the last pair. But when they asked people why they made that kind of decision, no one mentioned the order, right? These were identical. They were talking about things like the quality of the texture, or the fabric, or the brand, which were all lies because these were the same identical kinds of consumer products. But what's really interesting is that despite the fact that we don't have access to this kind of process, we often feel like we do, and in many ways we show what's called an illusion of explanatory depth. So people believe that they have a rich understanding of all these different kinds of causal systems in their environment, from how a light switch works to how a helicopter works. And so when you ask people to report their subjective understanding of how a helicopter works, people often report at this kind of level of detail, right? So I have a unique understanding of all the different kinds of features of helicopters, and I understand basically how that creates lift. But when you ask people to explain how helicopters work, their basic understanding is more like this, right? There are some blades that go around and it goes up, right? And so when we look at these kinds of causal systems, people often have a much poorer understanding than they believe they do. And we suggest that perhaps this sense that we understand human decision-making when we don't, much more, but where we have an objectively accurate understanding of how little we understand about algorithms may drive this kind of reluctance. And so this kind of idea that I understand how my doctor is making this decision, but I have no idea how the algorithm is making this decision, whether or not people actually understand what their doctor is doing, may drive this kind of reluctance. So we took a look at this in the context of a skin cancer melanoma detection application where we were able to talk to the dermatologist who had consulted with the company, and so we could build measures of objectively how the algorithm's making these decisions, how dermatologists make these kinds of decisions. And what we found is that people reported that they had a greater subjective understanding of how a human would make this kind of decision, how their doctor would make this decision about whether or not a particular spot was cancerous or benign than an algorithm. So people felt like they understood the human decision process much more than the algorithm. But when we tested them, they were objectively no more accurate in guessing whether or not how the human made the decision or how the algorithm made the decision. And we basically find that they're at chance for both guessing how their doctor made the decision and how the algorithm makes the decision. So in other words, people have no idea how their doctor is making medical decisions, but they think they understand how their doctor makes decisions. They have no idea how algorithms are making these decisions, and they don't think they understand how algorithms are making decisions. This is an important point. So the bias in both of these kinds of cases is more on how people are seeing people, not how people are seeing algorithms. Right? And so we find that this kind of subjective understanding is really important in terms of take-up too. So if we take ads for skin vision and we run advertisements on Google and we use their standard kind of marketing technique where they just describe skin vision, they say our algorithm checks if skin moles are cancerous moles, take pictures of your skin with a smartphone app, and get a skin cancer risk assessment. We see that there's about, in an ad campaign with about 14,000 impressions and 700 clicks, we see the average click-through rate for that is about 3%. If we just tweak that ad a little bit so that people feel like they have some subjective understanding of how the algorithm works. So if we say it checks mole shape, size, and color, our algorithm checks how similar skin moles are in shape, size, and color to cancerous moles. Take pictures of your skin with a smartphone app and get a skin cancer risk assessment. We see we almost double the click-through rate. And it's not, we've done other studies where we look at whether it matters whether we're telling people true explanations about how these things work, or if we don't give them the truth, but we give them a different explanation. And it doesn't matter what they actually understand, it's more about their subjective understanding about how algorithms work is influencing their utilization. So together, there's been a lot of work looking at barriers to algorithms and people's perceptions about, often their costs are ambiguous, their benefits are ambiguous, there's ambiguity in their risks, and there's ambiguity in their performances, and we're holding constant all of that in this work. And we're building on this literature that has often suggested that people have a prejudiced perception of algorithms. People don't like algorithms, and people don't want to use them as a result. And what our work suggests is it's not necessarily that people have a prejudiced perception of algorithms, and that's guiding their reluctance. What our work suggests is that people have a positively biased view of themselves and other people. So if we think about what's directing this kind of algorithm aversion, certainly there are many kinds of rational kinds of economic factors that are going on, but we suggest that many of the kinds of biases that people show when they compare themselves to other people, they're applying in their comparisons between self and algorithm. And so if we think about self-serving comparison as a framework, it works very nicely to explain many of the kinds of psychological barriers that are inhibiting people from relying on algorithms. And I'll give you an example that it goes beyond medical AI. So this is a new study I've been doing some colleagues at HBS, and basically what we look at is people's preferred level of automated car. So you can think about cars have varying levels of automation, from there's no automation involved to things like anti-lock braking, to the idea, we're not quite there yet, but to the idea of a fully automated car. And so what we ask people is, in two different kinds of conditions, to report the preferred level of automation of car to purchase. And in one condition, we ask people, what is the ideal level of automation for you to purchase? Like, what would you buy if you could? And we ask people in another condition, what would you want other people to buy if they could, right? And we see that people would prefer lower levels of automation for themselves than other people. So I want a car with anti-lock brakes. I want Nathan to be in a self-driving car.
Because you're an above-average driver.
Of course. And so that's actually what the data suggests, right? So when we ask people relative to a fully automated vehicle, how trustworthy and how safe a driver are you, people report that they're a more trustworthy and safer driver than the AV. When we ask people relative to the AV, how trustworthy and safe are other drivers, people think other drivers are about as trustworthy and safe as the AV. And these differences in performance ratings explain this difference between self and other for the levels of automation they prefer. Okay, so if we think about biased social comparisons, I think we can use this as a framework to figure out when are people going to be reluctant to rely on algorithms, and what can we do about it. So there are two kinds of dimensions that determine whether or not people exhibit biases in these kinds of comparisons between self and other, and we think between self and algorithm. So one is the identity relevance of the task or skill or domain. So experts, for example, often identify with their work, right? People may have social preferences or hobbies that they care a lot about. And so when things are not necessarily personally relevant, people should not be reluctant to rely on algorithms. But when something is critical to how you make your living, or what you enjoy doing, or your sense of accomplishment or self, those are the kinds of domains where we should see these kinds of threats arise and see people to be reluctant to rely on algorithms. The second kind of domain is sort of the ambiguity or latitude for bias, right? So the clearer or more objective a kind of comparison is, the less we can allow bias to creep in. And so if there are many ways to compare ourselves to other drivers, right? Or there are many ways to think about the quality of our driving, that's going to be a highly ambiguous kind of decision, and so we can be more biased in that kind of judgment. If we say, how many times have you gotten speeding tickets, right? Or how many times have you nicked your wheels when you've been parking? Those are less ambiguous kinds of domains, and so people may be more willing to rely on algorithms when the objective criteria are or the criteria are more objective. So if you look at the literature on algorithms and you think about all these different kinds of tasks, you can see that they do tend to fall into this two-dimensional plot, that as things become more identity relevant and more ambiguous, people seem to have more of a reluctance to rely on algorithms, and as things become less identity relevant and less ambiguous, people become more willing to rely on algorithms. You can even see for things like baking, biking, cooking, driving, and fishing, the more some people identify with these things very strongly and other people do not, and so that seems to moderate their reliance on algorithms across this kind of spectrum. Okay, so let's think about what we can take away. Well, if we think about identity relevance as being one factor that's reducing people, both experts and lay people, in terms of their reliance on algorithms, what can we do? Well, we can present algorithms as supporting, not replacing human judgment, as making recommendations rather than deciding for you. We can reduce the identity relevance of the task. So for a long time, people in the behavioral sciences did statistics by hand in their head, right? And now we are all relying on computers and statistical models to do that for us. But we don't feel like we're outsourcing our jobs to algorithms. We feel like these are tools that are helping us do our work better, right? So thinking about algorithms as being tools that are supporting us, not replacing us. We can frame the need for these kinds of services as for people, not for you, right? Because that may be less threatening. And we would think that it's going to also help us predict for whom, which segments of people will be more reluctant to rely on algorithms. And we think that this suggests that experts and people who have strong kinds of identity claims to these kinds of areas should be the ones who are most reticent to rely on algorithms. And the second dimension suggests how we can boost this adoption in other kinds of ways. So if the ambiguity is determining this kind of bias, we can explain how performance is evaluated to make comparisons more objective. We can stress objective differences between humans and algorithms, and we can explain how algorithms work. So if you go to ChatGPT now, they explain to you how they train the model, for example, and few people are really going to understand exactly how the model was trained after coming away from this, but that may give them the sense of objectivity or rigor there that is going to assuage their concerns. And I think these kinds of, as we get into more algorithms pervading our life and our work, there are a variety of real and perceived threats there. And so some of these kinds of real threats we have, or some of the real costs and benefits and risks, can be objectively measured. Other ones are still too ambiguous to figure out, but they're going to give us some sense of when we don't have the data, when we don't know what performance looks like, when we don't know what the costs and benefits look like, when are people going to be more reactive to these kinds of new technologies, and when will they embrace them? So thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.